All right, welcome to Witchpolice Radio. I'm here with someone who, it's funny because just before we started recording this, we were just talking about how this could have happened, I think, many times over the years. I mean, I've been doing this for a while. You've been doing your thing for quite a long time as well. And
Yeah.
just for whatever reason, it never happened, but I'm glad we're doing this now. And I think that the best way to sort of start this off is if you want to introduce yourself and just give a bit of background about what you do as an artist. And I know
Sure.
there's a lot of history with the label and everything else, but let's hear how you
Yeah.
would introduce yourself.
Okay. Thanks, Sam. Yeah. So my name's Adam Hannibal. I'm the manager of Balanced Records. In a few weeks, Balanced will be turning 22 years. So that's how long I've been doing this, like close to half my life now. So I run Balanced Records. I started that in 2001 with a few friends. It's an electronic label, although we definitely venture into a lot of reggae, funk, hip hop influences. It's kind of a mixed bag. And we like a lot of experimental and abstract things too. So it's a very balanced mix of music. That's sort of hence the title. In addition to that, I co-host a radio show on CKW that's been going on for almost 20 years too, called Quadrifunk. It's Friday nights, so I do that. And I was also one of the co-founders of a music festival called Meme or Mimetic that's still going strong. It'll be going on in June this year.
Yeah.
So yeah, I've kind of had my hand in various projects related to kind of mostly electronic music and styles like that, you know, whether it's events or physical releases or digital releases or whatever, or radio waves. So that's kind of that's the quick elevator description of what I've been doing, but there's a lot more there which we can unpack.
Of course, yeah. And I think that the way that I kind of got first balanced showed up on my radar is to the reggae side of things. I mean, that's sort of
Yeah.
yeah, I listen to a lot of different kinds of music, but reggae has always been kind of this like much larger pile than everything else in my record
Yeah.
collection, and
Yeah.
so through people like Seed Organization,
Yeah.
and going to some local events and things like that is kind of how I heard about the label and realized that there was someone putting out some dub stuff, some dancehall tinge stuff
Yeah.
in Winnipeg, and the electronic side of things, which I know is kind of the bulk of what the label has done.
Right.
Is an area that I've kind of dipped a toe into, but have never
Yeah.
really got super deeply engaged in. And throughout the course of doing the podcast, I've definitely talked to a lot of electronic artists, and that's kind of helped. And I've done that with some other genres too, but it still remains this kind of this scene and this genre and a series of genres that's a little
Yeah.
bit outside of my frame of reference. So it's always
Sure.
cool to have someone like you on to sort of talk about this, because it's a
Yeah.
vibrant, long-lasting part of the local music community, and it's just something that I've been sort of just on the periphery of.
Right. Well, yeah, it's very interesting. So, I mean, we got started in 2001, but we had been throwing parties like, raves and warehouse parties and stuff since 1995. And my thing, like, I started DJing in 1995 after collecting records, since like junior high kind of thing, biking down to like this store called Impulse Records, which is like Roman now, eventually ran Wild Planet, but
Wild
it used
Planet,
to be,
right?
kind of like industrial dance record shop. And that's kind of how I cut my teeth with a lot of that and like the early Ninja Tunes and Mo Wax kind of stuff. But for me, it was always about like, there'd always be like a main room that would have like the pumping house and techno and trance music. And then there'd always be like a side room that was the chill out room where you'd have like slow dub, sort of spacey, psychedelic, ambient, stuff like that. And I was always drawn to that because I just thought artistically there's way more interesting stuff going on, and the people that'd be in that room were just open-minded heads that would just be, let's connect or whatever. So the sort of the seeds of the label were all about like, well, how can we sort of like, tap into some of this creative force in Winnipeg, release some music, whatever that looks like we had no idea what we were doing, and try and sort of highlight some stuff on a map that we're doing, some interesting stuff with our scene. So back in the early 2000s, it was an interesting like nexus of home recording software was just sort of like SoundForge and stuff was just kind of coming up, and yeah, we had all these sort of people who were sort of experimenting with DJing and had a bit of a musical background, and were sort of trying to identify with what kind of sounds they wanted. So that was sort of the rationale with the labels, like, well, let's just try and like release some music. There's enough of a group of artists here. We felt like we had a bit of a collective, and we were kind of more on the left field, experimental, ambient dub end of things. And then from there, just sort of, organically grew into other, spindles of different types of music and stuff. So that was sort of the early seeds of what got us going. So.
Well, and obviously that whole scene of all those interconnected scenes, I guess,
Yeah,
hasn't really died down at all. It's if anything, it's gotten much bigger and much more kind of broader in terms of the different styles and different subgenres of subgenres of subgenres.
yeah,
Um,
yeah,
as evidenced by the label still being around and the festival still, going
yeah.
strong after all these years. So it must be kind of rewarding to see sort of the way the scene has kind of ballooned in the years that you've been contributing to it.
It's really fascinating. Yeah. Yeah, it was smaller in some ways, but it kind of before social media, it just sort of had to be more tighter and kind of communal because you'd go to the same record stores and meet up with the same kinds of people. And I remember there was like certain club nights where like there's a place called Cloud9 that was it in the Ramada, I guess, right? And they'd have like a hip hop night, then there'd be a drum and bass night, and there'd be like other nights, and we'd kind of all go to these nights together. And everybody kind of knew, all these scenes were interconnected, and so it was just
Yeah,
kind of And then over the years, I'd say it's gotten bigger in some ways and almost a bit more segmented. And then, of course, COVID kind of stuff happens too. But I feel like there's a bit of a reconnection going on now, just from what I can tell, is that we've had a few years away from a lot of these parties and people are hungry to get back at it and want to collaborate and find, ways to tap into each other. So maybe kind of ironically, I'm not quite as active on social media as I used to be, but I feel like there's a healthy momentum going in electronic music and all the different styles, and people are starting to kind of reconnect and coalesce again. So that's a good sign, I think. So
it is. That's really cool. Yeah, and I guess you have
yeah,
the benefit too of now that there's people who are making this kind of music who weren't even around, weren't even alive
yeah,
when you started this label, and they're 18, 19, 20, whatever, who are
yeah,
doing their own take on these styles of music, and you can kind of, because of the way everyone's connected, especially after a couple of years of not being able to do shows, everyone's kind of just found their people online, I think,
that's
and
right.
getting introduced to all this stuff that from people who maybe they did miss you the first time around, and now they're
Yeah,
probably going through the back catalog and picking up some of the what Winnipeg has put out there over the years.
right. That's right. So there's always kind of this rediscovery. Like I feel like the generations in music are, just a few years or something, and then you kind of dip your toe in it, and you'd be like, oh yeah, there's a whole new crew of people that have come up. Actually, I just read Chuck D was recently saying like hip hop, it's like the generations are like 5 years kind of thing.
Yeah,
Like every 5 years, right, you'll reach this new sort of level of different styles and different people, and I kind of feel like it's like that in electronic music too. Um, yeah, and so it's interesting because, and then we have places like Precursor and other places where people can go to actually learn production, and that kind of stuff wasn't really on the radar 20 years ago.
for
So
sure. Yeah,
there's sort of all the tools you can need, and you have Manitoba Music constantly giving great workshops and sort of refining people's skills. So it's really come a long way, because I feel like we were just sort of stumbling in the dark in those early days. We barely knew anything about distribution, and just sort of took our chance. But you learn some lessons, and for better for worse, I mean, I've rarely in the last 22 years been doing balance just as a full-time gig. I'm always having to do, it's kind of the reality of a Canadian music industry
yeah.
person.
Regardless of genre, yeah, it's just the
Yeah,
thing.
right.
Yeah,
So I always tell sort of the up and coming people, like, maybe don't set your, like, be ambitious, but like have some plan B's and C's in there, because if you're going to sort of hang your hat on just this as an option, that's a possibility, but it's probably good to have some other plans in place.
yeah,
Um, so yeah, I'm trying to think where I was going with this, but we've definitely just sort of learned organically, I think, is like trial and error, and see what sticks. And one of our sort of missions has not been so much about like trying to think what's going to sell. It's just like, what can we do that's creative and that we're really feeling, and it's kind of original, and just sort of that artistic integrity, which is a little bit cliche, but I really feel like that's what we've held on to consistently through all these years. So
well, that's interesting too, because that comes up so much on this show, whether I'm talking to a rapper or a country singer, or
yeah,
whatever the genre is, punk rock, right? Just that
yeah,
idea of authenticity and of being genuine, and doing something because like meaning what you're putting out there. I think that's
right,
I don't know if
yeah,
that's a local thing where just everyone here, because we're isolated and because it's a very
yeah,
tight knit community, everyone
right.
sort of wants to be real. I don't know. I don't know what
Yeah.
you think about that.
Yeah, I think we are a little bit cut off, even though we're probably, the world is, becoming a smaller micro place. But I feel like that was one of our kind of calling cards in the early days. I'd go to these music conferences and I'd talk about the isolation of Winnipeg kind of fueling, the creativity.
Yeah,
And our taglines is like surrounded by an ocean of wheat and snow, was kind of like a little like play on that, as like, we're really isolated. We hibernate and we make music, and I kind of use that to sort of promote what we were doing. So and then I also feel like there's just certain like mainstream things that Winnipeggers just don't latch onto as much, which I'm
for
kind
sure.
of proud of, honestly. I think it's great because we we just don't really go for all that stuff. So maybe it's changing a bit, but I think we've always had that. And one way I think this has an extra spin with electronic music is there's always been this allure and magnetism to like go see a DJ that's going to play a whole bunch of music you've never heard before and
Yeah.
take you places, and like sounds. And that's a little bit different than like going to a rock concert or whatever, where you want to hear certain sounds. Like there's a predictability that you're expecting from some of those artists. And for us, the draw and the sort of what would blow our minds was just like, oh man, I've never heard those tracks before. They're all on dub plates. They're not going to come out for 6 months or something. So it's all about those sort of rare, unique selections that define people. And so I think that's also been an ingredient that's helped sort of push us to be, as kind of unique and just as natural as we can with what we do. So
For sure, yeah, that is a kind of a distinct experience, because it's kind of like that sound system culture thing, right? Coming
right,
through all the
exactly.
decades, and
Yeah,
that doesn't exist. You're right; it doesn't exist with live bands or with even people DJing popular music, right? I mean,
yeah,
people are going to hear a certain song, and
yeah.
otherwise they're going to be disappointed. Whereas people are going to these shows to experience something.
Something, yeah, they want something new and unexpected versus give me something that's familiar that I can just sort of nod my head to. And I'm not saying that in a judgy way. It's just kind of like a different, experience that people seek. So yeah.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting too that the sort of the time frame in which you came up to as a label. I mean, going back, 20 plus years into the early 2000s,
Yeah.
there were a lot of different kind of parts of the music scene doing similar things. I mean, you had like Peanuts and Corn on the hip hop side,
Yeah.
and doing very similar things in the sense that it was all DIY. They were putting
Yeah.
out samplers and things every once in a while too, with all the artists on it, and
Right.
then there was like in the punk scene and the ska scene, there was all these little
Yeah.
labels started doing that same thing. And I don't know if it was just an era, like just something to do with what was going on, because it sort of predates barely the current situation we're in, right? I mean, there
Yeah.
was still stuff like Napster and all that happening then, but
Sure.
streaming and all the way the social media has taken over wasn't
Yeah.
the thing yet. It was like right at the
No,
beginning of that.
that's right. Yeah. I mean, I got some of my best advice. I used to go to this music conference called Midem in France, and it was neat because you'd have people like you're talking about from all different walks of life. There was like, I remember when like arts and crafts was getting started, I talked
Yeah,
to those guys a bit. And Derek from G7, I'd hang out with him. And he gave me
yeah,
some
that's a great
tips.
example. G7's a great example.
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah,
exactly. Yeah, G7. Yeah. And we had our very first studio in the A zone at like
oh,
above
cool.
Mondragon. So so that was just kind of like a neat Winnipeg thing where like very different music but kind of like, but politically and just like lifestyle wise, we had a lot in common with these guys. And it just seemed like a nice fit. So that's kind of a bit of a Winnipeg thing where the genres just sort of melt away and it's just more about people into their arts and understanding each other that way, and willing to help each other out too, like sort of that there wasn't that that sort of ego getting in the way or anything like that. Like we're all just sort of working together and on the same path that way. So yeah, I don't know if it was like what it was about that era, but it was a pretty special time because I think social media has really scripted things and become quite formulaic, right? And so I think there we were just all just in this discovery mode and
Yeah.
going for it. So yeah, it was pretty neat.
Well, it's cool too because a lot. I mean, again, not to hold this up against stuff that's come later, because there's a lot
Sure,
of great music in all those styles that's come since
definitely.
then. But so a lot of my favorite records from local artists are from that era. Like regardless of what genre of music it is, for some
Yeah,
reason, it's probably because of my age. Then
right.
I was a very impressionable age at that point. I was
Yeah,
like late teens, early 20s at the beginning of
yeah,
2000s, and so like that probably helped. But yeah,
yeah.
it just seemed like a very creative, very fertile kind of time period
Yeah.
for Winnipeg in general.
Yeah. I mean, I've got that same like kind of bias as I feel like it was such a golden era because it's this formative point in your life and also some new, musical tendrils are being formed, So I think I was in grade 12 when I went to my first rave and it really blew my mind, but it was also like the first raves were happening everywhere at that time. So it was a pretty special thing. And, now I don't think people have the same kind of firsts in the same way because you're probably going to see a TikTok video about whatever that experience is before you actually get to experience it yourself or something, right? So for better or for worse, I think there's something pretty special about discovering new art and new collectives of people that are like-minded, in the most sort of natural way, right? So
Yeah, yeah. Well, it's really interesting how sort of music consumption has changed, not just in the sense that people are downloading or streaming it, I guess, rather than
Yeah.
buying physical media, but more so like how it seems like every piece of music ever made is now sort of seen as on the same timeline for a lot of young people because there's
Right.
no differentiation. It's just all you press a button, it's there. So
Yeah.
a lot of that sort of idea of discovering something, you don't know when anything's from. I mean, I've had, I have a teenage daughter, and I
Yeah.
remember at a birthday party, her friends were talking about Eminem, and
Yeah.
I was like, I have that on tape downstairs,
Yeah.
and they didn't realize that he had been around more than like 6 months or whatever because
Right.
it was just something they discovered online,
That's
and it
really
was
interesting.
yeah. So
Yeah.
it's weird. It's weird. I don't know how. It's not really a question. It's just a weird observation about.
Well, yeah, everything is so instantaneous now. And like you said, a bit of like it's removed from its context. Cause
Yeah,
yeah, I remember we would, I'd read about music in magazine reviews before it was released, and then you'd do the mail order thing and wait a few
totally.
weeks, and you had this appreciation of the whole timeline, like you said. So yeah, it's interesting. It's the onus now is way more on the kids to do their own research and really dive into it in a different way. But it really has changed it. So and even even how we plan our releases, we kind of expect that it's such a short window of time where you're gonna do some promotion, and then you expect people are kind of their attention spans kind of gone on to, well, what's next, right? And we were focused a lot more on compilations, like long form compilations where you could really showcase a big range of styles, really tell
Yeah,
a story. And we still try and do that every once in a while, but it's kind of like, well, people just want really quick singles that they're just gonna, kind of the sound bitey stuff. um yeah, so it really has changed even in that time. We used to think, okay, the compilation is the way to do it, and that was such a big kind of calling card in electronic music. But it's really faded now, and maybe got overused or whatever. So now it's all about singles or even just one track, and
yeah.
uh, yeah, it's really changed. So
Well, the compilations were, I mean, as someone who kind of came up in the punk scene, like that was the way I discovered everything was through like
yeah, yeah,
compilations have like 20 bands on it, and you find like five of your favorite bands
right,
on this thing you bought for $5 at the record store, and yeah,
yeah.
it was definitely like a lost art. I think now people have playlists and mixes and stuff, but it's not the
It's not
same.
really the same though. Yeah, no, it's a bit different. So
So with a label, I mean,
yeah.
you're still doing this label. You have this pretty deep catalog at this point. How do you sort of adjust for this dystopian future that we're all in? I mean, you're still putting out physical music, which is great, and you're doing digital
Yeah,
stuff.
yeah.
And like you said, there's this kind of that short timeline of when you can actually promote it before it gets swept away on people's feeds and is gone forever.
Yeah.
Is there sort of a different way you have to approach releasing music at this point?
Well, I mean, yeah, let's see, where do I start here? I mean, so yeah, it's the approach that we used to do in like 2005 to maybe the next 5 or 6 years from that point is I'd go to a lot of music conferences. I would be promoting our artists, but I'd also be trying to, do some A&R and discover other artists. And that worked pretty well for a while. And then I've kind of like, just in terms of the point of my life now where I've got like 3 young girls and, I'm just settled down. I'm pretty busy with my day job as a school psychologist. So that takes a lot of work too. And so we've got a pretty good crop of artists we've worked with in the last 20 years. And they kind of just every once in a while, somebody will pop up and be like, hey, what do you guys think of this? And it's pretty neat because a lot of times it comes to us already mastered. They have their own artwork. I have to say, it's like either we've built some really good relations, or people just know I'm going to make this as easy as I can for you to release it, kind of thing. And yeah, and so we're more or less almost like more of a distributor, and for some people, and others people we do more of the mastering and the marketing and stuff. But most people come to us without illusions that we're going to be doing like a 6 month
Yeah,
high intensity marketing campaign and that they're going to become big stars from this. Like they just kind of know the industry. Most people have also done their own like self-releasing or been with other labels. So I think there's kind of just an understanding that like, hey, I want to get my art out there. I want to join forces with you, and and then we'll keep this thing going for as long as we can, kind of thing. So maybe our expectations have lowered, or they're just a bit more realistic. Whereas before we used to deal with some artists that just expected really big things would come, and that's just the reality. Is it's just really hard, even if you have the best publicist in the world and the best team.
yeah,
You'll only get so far. And kind of interestingly, we've always had a crop of artists that have had kind of like their foot in the door doing other kinds of work or have families, and they're not necessarily looking to tour the world. They just want to get some music out and aren't under any illusions of what that'll look like. So I think we've had like people like Rise Ashen, who's in Ottawa, and he's kind of like a spoke for us, who's connected us with all kinds of other artists. And then the seed organization, like Spencer's been in Montreal for 10 years now.
Okay.
And he started a couple sub labels there. He's got one called Serious Vibes, and he used to have one called Greenhouse, and that was more of our sort of heavier dub, bass, influence reggae and stuff. And that's still going strong. So we kind of just sort of set up some different systems where things are just kind of perpetuating themselves now. And occasionally we do get some new artists and everything, but it's largely just we've kind of got our crop that we go through, and it's kind of about, well, what can I manage at the end of the day and what can Spencer manage, and we're just kind of realistic about it. And we've made it, I think we've just sort of adapted well to making this a long-term sustainable project without burning ourselves out or sort of overcommitting to things. We just kind of have a good pace of things, and we're a little bit laissez-faire almost at this point. I'm just like, well, okay, these are the 3 releases we're going to plan, and we'll have a rough timeline, and if it works out that way, that's okay. And all the artists are pretty cool and chill with things, so
That's awesome. It's nice to have that kind of comfortable home for all these artists too, right? Where
yeah,
they know what to expect, and they've worked with you before so many times, and it seems like a very not easy but comfortable way to.
It's comfortable, and I think it's just like a well-worn path at this point. So we've it becomes almost hands-free at a point. We just put in what we have to do. And so it works pretty well. I mean, if somebody really wanted to tour a lot and really hit the festivals and have a really strong social media team behind them, that's we can't quite commit to that. So we're just very clear with people what we can commit to, and it works out good. And I think we have a good reputation for being like fair and transparent, and that kind of thing. So
yeah, that's awesome. So with all this history of the label, how much of this music is still available? I mean, is it all still floating around out there in the ether somewhere, or is there some stuff that's just long gone and way out of print?
Yeah, well, good question. Some of our earlier CDs, you'll still see, I'm certainly, if you wanted to find on like Discogs or things like that, you could. Right. Our main distributor is called Groove Distribution in Chicago, and they still have quite a bit of stuff up. But it's funny, we recently redid our website, and we didn't sort of go all the way back. We just sort of went back to maybe about 10 years to stuff that's just a bit more sought after still. And, so, obviously things are still available digitally, but we have sold out a number of our vinyl only releases. And, I don't know if we're going to repress any of those anytime soon, just because vinyl's a bit of a headache with all the waiting times and, and the shipping costs now. So a lot of it is still out there, but we're not sort of like hustling or pushing it as much as we are with, say, the latter half of our catalog or so. So
that makes sense, though. I mean, the old stuff's had time to be heard, right?
That's right. Yeah, it's out there, but I mean, if I go to these record conventions where I know I've seen you, and I sometimes just sling some of that stuff out there, just like, it's still taking up some room in my basement, some of those CDs. And so part of it's just making room for new stuff and that kind of thing. So, yeah.
How do people find your music online? I mean, again, like you said, a lot of it's out there for streaming. What's the best way to find Balanced and just sort of go through what's out there, whether it's, for the past 10 years or longer?
Yeah, I would say between the website and our Bandcamp page, that's where you can really delve into a lot of the stuff. So yeah, the Bandcamp actually doesn't go all the way back either. So it's kind of funny, like some of that stuff is just a bit obscure, which I kind of like if you really have to do some work to really dig into that. And I've always been into kind of more obscure labels and stuff. But I would say between, the website, which is just Balanced with a D at the end, and then -records.com, or just search Bandcamp and you'll sort of stumble on our stuff. So those are kind of the 2 main ways. And, every once in a while we'll do deals for film and TV, and I've seen people literally comment of like, oh, I stumbled on this through whatever, this weird commercial or some obscure film, Shazamming it kind of thing. So yeah, there's some of that, and obviously like radio play and some of the classic ways of promoting your music has been good for us. So
do you have releases coming out in the near future, or is that to be determined?
Yeah, no, we've got it's funny, we slowed down right before COVID and stuff. And then basically when I had twins in 2018, things really slowed down.
Sure.
And then we've been firing up pretty strong since 2020. And especially Spencer, he's got a few titles coming out in the Serious Vibes. So there's one about a month away that should be coming out, a single with a woman named Icky out of Montreal. She does some really neat kind of abstract, bassy stuff.
Cool.
And then Rise Ashen has a neat project with a guy named Mello. It's kind of a bit more like Afro tribal influenced, but also a little bit laid back. So that's coming out. And I've got an interesting project in the work. I think you'll be into this. It's I'm jamming with a couple of friends where like we've got guitar and bass, a whole bunch of pedals. I do a lot of the beats and stuff, and it's kind of a weird fusion of like psychedelic jammy stuff with like dub and techno influences and
Cool.
electronics. So that's called old tech. We're just kind of making fun of ourselves that we're the old tech. And that, yeah, we've got a couple singles. They'll probably be more like summer, fall that's finally coming out. So anyway, yeah. So we've got a lot going on.
And then the festival too in the summer.
Yeah, Meme is coming. It's the second week in June. There'll be a night at the Cube on the Saturday, and then there'll be a show at Little Brown Jug in the Pyramid as well. So I'm not quite as involved, but I do a little bit of the programming still and just kind of consult here and there. So that's encouraging because I've kind of, with Balance, we're not really doing as much like release parties or, some of that kind of hustling. So I've kind of channeled that into some of the mimetic events a little bit more. So at least for the time being. So.
Well, it's cool. It's cool that you're still doing this. I mean, like, I think that one of the cool things about doing things at such a DIY level is that a lot of people who are trying, like, you said before about people trying to become famous or whatever, and they're thinking they're gonna hit it big. I find a lot of people like that, regardless of genre of music, they quit. They quit after a few years when
For
it's not
sure.
happening. And it's people who doing what you're doing, who have been
Yeah.
sort of sticking to it and doing this underground DIY thing, who tend to be consistently coming up with cool stuff for
Right.
decades, rather than this like big rush of attempted success and then
Yeah.
disappearing off
Yeah.
the map. So it's always cool to
Right.
see that when someone's been plugging away, and reaching the audience that it's intended to reach, the people who
Yeah,
are
I
there
know.
for it, right?
Right. Yeah. And yeah, you don't want to like crash and burn, which we've obviously seen lots of examples of that. So it's kind
Cool.
of funny because I probably haven't like heeded the best advice along the way. It's funny, you go to these like music conferences and there's always these tips of like, the latest marketing strategies on it. By and large, I'll pay a little bit of attention to that, but we just kind of do our own thing. And, maybe we're not achieving, the highest levels all the time or whatever, but it's like, it's sustainable. I kind of know there's a constancy there that's just going to keep moving us along. And like I said, the artists that we deal with know what to expect. And I think our fan base does too. So I'm kind of just playing the long game, not getting too caught up in the latest trends and, all that kind of stuff. And as you get older, you just kind of get more set in your ways, I guess, too. So that's
Oh,
just
for
what's
sure. Yeah, I know what that's like.
yeah, yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Awesome.